Every Sunday, his children sat across from him and talked about his money like he wasn't in the room. 12 years of silence. 12 years of them being wrong. He heard every word, and he was about to prove it. His name was Bishop Foster, and for 12 years, he did not speak one single word. Not at breakfast, not at his wife's grave, not when his own children stood over him and decided, out loud, in front of him, that he was no longer capable of understanding what was being said. They filled out his forms. They spoke for him in rooms he was sitting in. They assumed that because his voice had gone quiet, so had everything else about him. What none of them knew, what not one single person in that family suspected, was that Bishop Foster had heard every word. He had remembered every date, every meeting, every lie told across his own kitchen table while they thought he was simply staring at the wall. And on the day his signature finally touched paper again, it did not just end his silence. It ended theirs. Let me be honest with you before we go any further. This story is fiction, but if you've ever sat in a room while someone underestimated you, spoke over you, or decided who you were without asking, you already know the feeling is real. Stay with me. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because you will want to see exactly how far Bishop's silence really went. 12 years ago, Bishop Foster was not a man anyone described as fragile. He had built Foster Family Trucking and Logistics from 2 second-hand trucks and a handshake with a produce distributor outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and he ran it the way he ran everything else in his life, with steady hands and very few wasted words. His wife, Adele, had passed from a long illness the year before the accident that would change everything, and grief had already softened Bishop in ways his children mistook for weakness rather than what it actually was. A man quietly rebuilding himself around a loss no one else in the family fully understood. Bishop and Adele had 2 children. Cedric, the elder, was expected to inherit the business the way sons in families like theirs usually did, more by assumption than by earned right. Andre, younger and sharper in certain ways, had left for a marketing career in Atlanta and came home only when it suited him. Both children loved their father in the uncomplicated way children do when they have never once had to worry about where the money came from. Neither of them truly understood how the company worked. They knew the name on the trucks. They did not know the man who had built it from nothing twice, once with his hands, and once, quietly, with his silence. What outsiders never saw was the strain sitting underneath the family's comfortable surface. Cedric had struggled for years with a drinking habit he never spoke about, one that worsened whenever the weight of being the presumed heir grew too heavy to carry alone. Bishop knew. He had known for years, and had chosen, the way fathers sometimes do, to hope quietly rather than confront directly, believing there would always be more time to have the harder conversation later. On a wet October night, Bishop asked Cedric to ride along to check on a delayed shipment at the yard, the kind of small errand fathers hand their sons hoping to build a bridge neither one knows how to build with words. Cedric had asked if it could wait until morning, the roads already slick and the forecast calling for worse. Bishop said no, that some things were better handled the same night, and Cedric agreed without pushing back. It was a small decision, the kind made 1,000 times in 1,000 families without consequence. On this particular night, it was not small at all. Bishop had insisted they go, and for years afterward, he privately believed that if he had simply said yes to waiting until morning, none of it would have happened. He never told a single person he felt that way. The truck went into the guardrail on the Old River Road, a curve every driver in that county had taken 1,000 times without incident. Cedric walked away with a broken collarbone. Bishop did not walk away the same man who had gotten into that truck. In the last clear second before the crash, Bishop turned and saw his son looking down, not at the road, but at the small glowing light of a phone in his lap. A single word was still lit on the screen when it was over, a message from Andre, sent from 3 states away, about nothing more than a holiday and a schedule. It meant nothing to anyone in the world except the 2 people in that truck. To Cedric, it was a glance that lasted less than a second. To Bishop, it was the last thing he ever saw before everything went dark, and the one thing he could never bring himself to say out loud. In the ambulance, Bishop tried to speak and found that he could not. The doctors called it shock, a trauma response that would pass with time. It never fully did. But it was not only the crash that silenced him. It was the choice sitting quietly underneath it, the choice to protect his son from a truth that could break him, even if it meant Bishop would have to carry that truth alone, in silence, for as long as it took. Andre would not learn for 12 years that his own small, ordinary message had been the last thing his brother ever looked at before that road took everything from their family. Bishop knew, and he never told a soul. The investigation ruled it an accident, wet roads and poor visibility, and Cedric's account of swerving for a deer that no other witness ever saw went unchallenged, because grief tends to make people generous with the truth. Bishop's silence, in the early months, was treated as an unfortunate but understandable consequence of trauma. A man loses his wife and very nearly his son in the same short stretch of time. Of course, something in him goes quiet. No one thought to ask why Bishop flinched every time Cedric raised his voice, or why he stopped allowing Cedric to drive him anywhere at all. By the second year, the silence had calcified into something the family simply worked around. Andre handled Bishop's medical appointments and spoke for him at every one of them. Cedric, carrying a guilt he had never confessed even to himself in full, threw himself into running the company his father had built, chasing competence as if it could substitute for confession. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, and the fear ate at him steadily, year after year, in ways his family mistook for simple ambition. The truth was, Cedric could not walk past the river road without his hands beginning to shake, and he had rerouted every driver's schedule in the company so that stretch of highway was never assigned to him again. A decision he explained to no one and no one thought to question. At night, long after the office had emptied out, he would sit alone at his father's old desk with the ledgers open in front of him, working numbers that did not need working, because the alternative was silence, and silence, for Cedric, had become its own kind of accusation. He drank less in those years, not because the guilt had eased, but because he had grown afraid of what he might say out loud if he ever let himself lose control the way he had that October night. Once, on the anniversary of the accident, Cedric drove out to the river road alone, parked at the guardrail that had since been replaced, and sat there for nearly an hour without getting out of the car. He never told anyone he had gone. He did not know, and would not know for years, that his father had begun asking Nathaniel, in the careful shorthand of notes passed silently across a kitchen table, to quietly track which days Cedric left the office early and did not say where he was going. Bishop already suspected where his son disappeared to on that date every year. He simply had no way, yet, of telling anyone that he knew. By the 5th year, Andre had grown tired of what he called managing his father. Bishop attended family gatherings and sat, present but unreachable, and Andre had begun, quietly at first, to ask his wife whether it was time to consider a care facility, somewhere Bishop would be looked after by people equipped for what the family assumed was a man slipping further away each year. He raised it once at dinner, in front of Bishop, using the kind of clinical language people use when they have already decided something and are only waiting for permission to say it out loud. Bishop sat through it without a flicker of reaction, and Andre took the stillness as proof he was right. There was one night, in the 7th year, when Cedric came to his father's house late, well past midnight, and sat across from him at the kitchen table the way Nathaniel usually did, except this time with nothing in his hands, no ledger, no excuse. He looked at Bishop for a long time and said he needed to tell him something about that night on the river road, something he had never told anyone, and his voice cracked in a way that made it clear he had finally reached the end of what he could carry alone. Bishop reached across the table and gripped his son's hand, hard, and shook his head slowly, over and over, until Cedric stopped talking. It was the closest thing to a conversation the two of them ever had about it, a confession that never fully arrived and a silence that answered it anyway. Cedric left that night, believing his father simply could not bear to hear it. He never considered that his father already knew every word he had been about to say. What Andre did not say out loud, not even to his wife, was that some nights he lay awake unsettled by a memory he could not fully explain. He remembered, faintly, being a boy of no more than 9 or 10 years before the accident, and hearing his father on the phone late one night, his voice low and worried, saying something about Cedric that he had never been able to fully recall. He told himself, every time the memory surfaced, that it meant nothing, that grief simply invents things to explain itself. It would be years before he let himself sit with the possibility that some part of him had always known there was more to his brother's struggle than the family had agreed to believe. What none of them accounted for was Nathaniel Boone. Nathaniel had worked the foster yard since before Cedric was born, a company man in the truest sense, the kind who remembered every driver's birthday and every late payment history by heart. What almost no one still living remembered was how Nathaniel came to work there at all. He had come home from prison at 22, a conviction from his teenage years that followed him to every hiring office in the county, doors closing before he could finish a sentence. Bishop hired him anyway, on nothing but a handshake and a look in the young man's eyes that told him more than any application ever could. Nathaniel never forgot it, and in the decades since, he had quietly built his entire life around making sure Bishop Foster never once regretted that decision. After the accident, it was Nathaniel who quietly kept daily operations steady while Cedric learned to lead, and it was Nathaniel who, without ever being asked, began stopping by Bishop's house twice a week with the company ledgers, sitting across from him at the same kitchen table where Bishop used to do the books himself, reading the numbers aloud to a man everyone else had stopped talking to entirely. He never expected an answer. He simply believed, the way some people simply believe things without needing proof, that Bishop Foster was still in there, and that a man who built a company from nothing deserved to know what was happening to it, even in silence. What Nathaniel did not know was that Bishop had never stopped tracking the business at all. He read every document left with him. He caught, more than once, small inconsistencies in the numbers that even Nathaniel had missed, circling them in the margin with a pin for Nathaniel to find on his next visit. For 12 years, Bishop Foster was not fading. He was watching, carefully, over everything he had built. The ownership of the company itself had quietly shifted in the background of all this, though not in the way anyone in the family understood. In the year after Adele's passing, long before the accident ever happened, Bishop had grown concerned enough about Cedric's drinking that he restructured the company without telling either of his children, placing controlling interest in a trust that named only Bishop himself as the party with authority to release it, under conditions written and held by Marion Blake, the family attorney. Bishop had trusted no one else with that decision, not because he doubted his children's love for him, but because he understood, long before the accident ever happened, that love and readiness are not always the same thing. Marion had her own reasons for guarding that trust so carefully. She and Adele had been close friends since college, decades before either woman had a husband or a family name to protect, and in her final months, Adele had made Marion promise something she never explained in full. She asked Marion to watch over Bishop, quietly and without being asked, if the day ever came when their children stopped seeing him clearly. Adele had not known what form that day would take. She had simply known her family well enough to suspect it was coming. By the 10th year, Andre's patience had run out entirely. With Cedric's quiet blessing, more out of exhaustion than malice, he began the legal process to have Bishop declared incompetent, a step that would allow the family to formally take control of whatever remained in his name and finally close a chapter he considered long overdue. Marion Blake received the filing with a discomfort she could not entirely explain, aware of instructions Bishop had left behind that the rest of the family knew nothing about. The filing did not sit quietly while it waited to be resolved. Word of it reached the company's board of regional partners, men and women who had done business with Bishop for decades and had never once, in all that time, questioned whether the Foster name still meant something steady and dependable. A partner in Raleigh called Cedric directly, asking pointed questions about who would actually control the company's decisions if Bishop were declared incompetent, and whether Cedric himself was prepared to answer for the direction Andre was pushing. Cedric found himself defending a decision he had barely thought through, and for the first time in 10 years, the fear that had lived quietly underneath his composure rose close enough to the surface that his hands shook again in a boardroom, in front of people whose trust the company depended on. There was one more belief Andre had quietly carried for years, one he had never said out loud to anyone. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, he had convinced himself that Nathaniel Boone, not Cedric, had been behind the wheel that night. It was easier to believe. A loyal old employee was simpler to blame than his own brother. Now, with his father's competency in question, that old belief hardened into something Andre was finally ready to act on. He began quietly building a case to push Nathaniel out of the company for good, certain, in his heart, that he was finally righting an old wrong. You've made it this far, and that tells me this story means something to you. Bishop had a choice sitting in front of him now, Protect the son who nearly cost him everything, or let an innocent man take the blame in his place. So let me ask, what would you have done in his shoes? I go through every comment, and I'd genuinely love to know. Marion Blake called a meeting. She told the family it concerned Bishop's competency filing and asked that Bishop be present, a request Andre found strange but did not fight, assuming his father would simply sit through it the way he sat through everything else. What none of them knew, walking into that room, was that Marion had spent time with Bishop 2 weeks earlier, using a method neither Andre nor Cedric had thought to try in 12 years. She had brought him a pen and a legal pad, and simply asked whether he understood exactly what was happening around him. Bishop wrote for nearly 15 minutes without stopping. He wrote about the accident, about the message on the phone he had never spoken of, and whose name had been on that screen. About 12 years of watching his son carry a weight that was slowly destroying him from the inside, while everyone around him searched for someone else to blame, and 12 years of watching his younger son carry a smaller, quieter weight of his own without ever understanding why. He wrote that he had never told a soul because Cedric was still his son, and one terrible night on a wet road did not erase a lifetime of loving him, but that he would not, could not, allow Nathaniel Boone, the one man who had never once asked him for anything in over 30 years, to be sacrificed for a truth that belonged to his own family alone to carry. In the meeting, with Andre already speaking over him the way he had for 12 years, Marion Blake set a single document on the table. It was not the incompetency filing. It was a sworn, notarized statement in Bishop's own hand and signature, confirming his full mental competency, releasing the trust into his sole control, and detailing, in careful, unflinching language, what he had witnessed the night of the accident. Bishop Foster picked up the pen a second time, in front of his children, and signed his name beneath it, breaking 12 years of silence with the only tool he had left that no one in that room could argue with. The room did not erupt the way rooms do in films. Andre went pale and silent in a way that mirrored, uncomfortably, the very silence he had spent years dismissing in his father, and the half-remembered phone call from his childhood surfaced fully for the first time, no longer something he could tell himself meant nothing. When he understood, finally, whose message had been on that screen the night of the accident, something in him that had been quietly braced for 12 years without knowing why finally set itself down. Cedric did not deny it. He put his head down on the table and, for the first time in 12 years, said his mother's name out loud, followed by an apology no one in that room was prepared to witness. Bishop did not raise his voice, because he still could not, but he did not need to. He simply sat, steady as he had always been, and let the paper say what he had carried alone for over a decade. In the weeks that followed, the family began the slow, uneven work of rebuilding something honest out of what had been built on avoidance. Cedric entered treatment 2 states away, choosing a program with no connection to the company or the family name, and called his father once a week, at first only to sit in silence together over the phone, and later, gradually, to talk. Bishop could not yet say much back, but he stayed on the line every single time, and Cedric said afterward that those calls, more than anything else, were what convinced him to keep going. Andre, humbled in a manner he would not have chosen for himself, went to Nathaniel Boone privately to apologize for the case he had quietly built against him. Nathaniel accepted it plainly, without ceremony, and told him the only thing he had ever wanted was to see Bishop treated with the respect the family owed him. He did not ask for a title or a promotion. He asked only that they keep listening, now that they'd finally started. Andre also returned, formally, to the board of regional partners who had questioned Cedric, this time presenting the company's true ownership structure honestly, and asked for nothing but the chance to rebuild the trust his family had nearly spent without knowing it. A year later, on a warm Sunday in early summer, the Foster family gathered in Bishop's backyard for the first cookout the company had hosted since before Adele passed. Nathaniel stood at the grill the way he always insisted on doing, waving off every offer of help. Cedric, 6 months sober and steady in a way he had not been in over a decade, brought his father a plate before anyone thought to ask, and sat beside him instead of across from him, the way he used to. Andre's children ran through the yard chasing a dog that belonged to no one in particular, and Marion Blake, who had kept a promise to her oldest friend for 12 quiet years, sat back in a lawn chair and finally let herself relax. At one point, Bishop raised his glass, and though his words still came slowly, every single person at that table went quiet and leaned in to listen, because for the first time in a very long time, they understood exactly how much they had almost lost the chance to hear. Bishop Foster speaks now, slowly, in short, careful sentences that took months of quiet work to rebuild, and his family listens in a way they never fully learned to before. He still keeps the legal pad from that meeting in his nightstand, the one filled with 12 years of thoughts no one had thought to ask about. He takes it out sometimes, not to prove a point, but simply to remember that even in the years he said nothing at all, he never once stopped watching over the people he loved, in the only way that was left to him. Bishop's silence was never the absence of a voice. It was love, holding itself still, waiting for the right moment to finally speak. Thank you for giving this story your time. That's not something I take lightly. If it meant something to you, subscribe, share it with someone who'd feel it too, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I go through every single one, and I always respond. See you in the next story.